And today's panel is all about leading innovation, the importance of having leaders that will help facilitate innovation, that will allow their space the time that they need to try new things, to not be afraid that some of those things might fail as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our fantastic panel. We have 4 great panelists here today. We have Seong Park, who's the Deputy Director of the Digital Government Cooperation Division in the Republic of Korea. She's co-chair with EY yesterday of a workshop for program and project management professionals. So it will be interesting to get their take on what innovative leadership looks like. Next, we have Oliver Jones, who's Global Government and Public Sector Strategy Leader and Partner, Geostrategic Business Group in EY. And Oliver chaired yesterday a workshop that was for policy, operational delivery, and research professionals. Then we have Magnus Enzel, who's Senior Advisor from the Department for Digital Government, Ministry of Infrastructure, joining us from deepest, darkest Sweden today. He was co-chair with EY of a workshop for officials working in workforce, workplace, and property areas. Last but not least, we have Susan Ackland-Hood, who is Acting Permanent Secretary, Department for Education in the United Kingdom. And Susan yesterday chaired the workshop on staff engagement, communications, and change management, so for officials working in those areas. So we'll get their take on what innovative leadership looks like. This is the 3rd time we are launching into our questions, so hopefully, fingers crossed, this will all go swimmingly from now on. Seong, I'm going to come to you again. You must know this off by heart now, but I'm going to ask you, what does an innovative leader look like in program and project management?
Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me now. Well, these things happen. And so what I found in innovative leader looks like in program and project management are they know how to make the most of what they have and then always trying to find a better solution to improve services. And with brands, but they still have drive to expand their knowledge and enhance skills. And they're also open to learning from others. I like to introduce a case of my colleague within our ministry. So normally the Korean government's tendency is to build a new system when we are launching a service. However, the pandemic kind of forced us to move quickly to deliver the relief fund to our citizens. And then we didn't have enough time to go through the lengthy procurement process and then build another giant system that can withstand heavy traffic. So my colleague suggested that we work with credit card companies by simply creating a link to share necessary data between the government and the credit card companies so that we can deliver the funds to our citizens. So result, deliver relief funds to 99.1% of the population within a month. And he has all the skills that I mentioned in the beginning to be an innovative leader. One thing that I wanted to add was even with his idea, if he didn't have environment to realize his ideas or back up from the leadership, we wouldn't have seen his innovation. So it's not only the innovative leader that can lead innovation within the government. They need to have a right environment and then right support from the leadership.
Right.
And one of the challenges that was discussed during the yesterday's workshop were a lot of civil servants think that the most major difficulty is organization silos, followed by lack of skills, data privacy issues, lack of leadership, and narrow focus implementation when it comes to driving innovation in program and then project management.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll pick up on quite a lot of those issues when we get to our discussion. But I think definitely the issue of COVID having forced innovation is something that's been coming up throughout the day. And the idea of an innovative leader being somebody who welcomes ideas as well and is constantly looking to improve. Oliver, I'm going to come to you now and I'm going to ask a similar question. So that is kind of, how could innovation in policy, research and operational delivery generate benefits, and what does a good leader look like in that sort of respect?
Thanks very much, Siobhan, and hi everybody in the audience. It's great to be here today. One of the really big themes coming out of our breakout session was that innovation is a mechanism for identifying and addressing current policy and operational problems. And that sounds really obvious, but I think the crucial nuance is that it's real world and it's today's problems. Innovation's not about solving problems in 5 or 10 years' time. It's about solving the problems that are facing us today. And so when we think about sort of defining a leader in that situation, well, particularly in the policy and kind of development space, is that they are working on today's problems. They're not off in a separate group. They're at the coalface of sorting out society's biggest problems today. So that's sort of the big headline, and let me just add a couple of extra points. The second point about these leaders is that there are lots of them, particularly over the last year. You mentioned briefly there in your intro to me around the COVID and its impact, and we actually did a poll of participants, and we asked them a sort of before and after question about how innovative government had been. And when we asked about how innovative governments were before COVID, there were various answers, and one was highly, and that got 0%, and even moderately only got 16%. And then we asked them for their view post-COVID, and I'll just look at this, that 16% said that governments were highly innovative, and 72% said that they were moderately innovative. So our audience definitely felt that there were lots of leaders out there producing lots of innovation over the last year or so. There's lots of leaders out there who can do this stuff. It's not that rare, particularly when the conditions allow. So leaders are working on real problems today. There are lots of them because they've just proved it over the last year. They're also diverse. We looked at a case study which had nothing to do with AI or high tech or big data or any of the things you often associate with innovation. And in fact, it was an Indian case study about getting more females into the workforce and therefore delivering a huge number of economic, but also health, educational and benefits, and greatly reducing domestic violence. And it wasn't perhaps a classic innovation space yet. The policy process and the research process that led up to it had been highly innovative. And so our leaders are diverse. They're not just AI specialists. They're not just tech specialists, incredibly valuable though those people are. And then the very last point that our leaders are is that they're effective. So again, the group was very clear that innovation should be subject to the same rules as everyone else, which is it actually working? Is there evidence that it's working on the ground and getting real results as well? So very briefly, that was our view on leaders.
Fantastic, thank you. I like that. I haven't heard it put that way, that actually innovation is today. It's happening today. It's quite urgent because sometimes there's a kind of concept that it's something that can be done over a long period of time. And it's so crucial that we keep mentioning diversity because all the evidence shows that we get better results, whether it's an innovation or delivery or anything, in terms of delivering services that work for everybody when we have that more diverse workforce and leadership. Magnus, I'm going to come to you next. So what did an innovative leader look like for the officials in your workshop yesterday?
Yes, we had, thank you for being here, by the way. And we had a fantastic discussion. We talked about lots of different themes. What came back consistently was that an innovative leader needs to be able to handle cross-functional discussions. This is tricky in a stovepipe administration that we all live in, of course, but it's sort of a necessary criteria to be able to force people into a discussion that is cross-stovepipe, be able to bring that knowledge back into where you are going to face your challenges. One note on that was that also I took this as being part of the UK environment, that a lot of that basic education for civil servants was outsourced, and that was sort of taken as maybe it's time to bring that home, in terms of that innovation in the public sector does have its very specific criteria or to work within, and that means there's a special knowledge that needs to be brought out in the public sector. You can't say it's the same thing outside or inside the public sector, the innovation part. We talked also about the project leadership is sort of a model in that sense, because project managers sort of move in and out of different sectors, and they sort of build that specific competence up during the years. Another reflection was that you need to be able to handle the digital transformation. COVID has made this very obvious, with just the workplace being blown apart. How do you handle that? And part of that is not the technical competence. It's rather a change management, but specifically sort of a data analytical question. How do you handle these new types of data sources that comes in, and how do you recruit the people that can handle this new type of knowledge flow? How can you make them stay in a healthy culture, still providing that innovative impetus that they can give, but at the same time provide sort of the strict framework within which they have to work when they're in the public sector? So that's a couple of points from my workshop.
Thank you, fantastic. I really like that sense of having to have the ability to work across, to have those conversations across departments, across different professions and functions. But really nice the way you put it there as well, that we need to, in civil services, recruit and retain the best people. But in so doing, bringing them in from different sectors, they also have to recognise and be able to work within the very unique setting of the public sector. And that always hasn't in the past necessarily been done in the most effective way, I think. Thank you so much, Susan. I'm going to come to you for your thoughts as well, based on the workshop you had yesterday with staff who work in staff engagement and communication. So what did they feel like an innovative leader would look like, and the benefits of having that?
Siobhan, thank you very much indeed. And I'd like to thank everyone who took part in the workshop yesterday. It was actually staff from all professions talking about what had worked for them on engagement and communications. And I think the first rather simple takeaway was that a good leader can't communicate too much. So lots of people talked about moments when they felt as though leadership thought they were communicating, but staff didn't feel communicated with, and certainly didn't feel heard. And that was the second point, which was that good quality communication is genuinely two-way. And that led us, as we took into the second part of the workshop about how we might do this differently in the future, to a conversation about the extent to which a lot of the traditional models for engagement, we looked at the Cotter model, which is a reasonably well-known model for engagement around change programs, assume that you're doing a large top-down organizational change program and that you're communicating out to the organization. And we talked a lot about how in lots of the work that we're doing, actually what you want to do is generate an environment in which there's lots of insurgent change going on all over the place. And indeed, the communication is much more distributed. And that took us into a set of conversations about understanding what kind of change you're trying to lead. So sometimes I talked a bit about my experience in the Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service in the UK, which is the job I had immediately before this one, where we were leading a large transformation programme, which was really about putting in place not just the digital, but some of the process changes that were going to get us to a place where we could give more permission and more ability for staff to make change. And there was a combination there of some top-down change, which we needed to communicate and engage staff with, which we did through a very large programme called One Conversation, which was sort of local line manager-led change discussions, but also how you start to want to show and grow what you want to see, which is much more bottom-up, much more organic, much more rapid cycle change and improvement. We also had a really good set of conversations about some of the themes that have come through other people's contributions here already around permission, space to innovate, and risk. And we talked a bit about how you can manage risk in environments where the stakes are high. And I think one of the challenges of leading in the public service is that it's actually right in many of the businesses we're in that tolerance of failure is low. So, I ran the courts, and our tolerance of ending up with, a miscarriage of justice is and should be fundamentally really low. But how do we make sure we're not applying the same risk appetite to those very high stakes activities to everything we do? There's a risk that we become kind of infected by a low risk appetite compliance culture, even across parts of our business where actually we could be much freer. And we talked a bit about making sure people have got really clearly identified spaces to innovate in, where we give active permission, because otherwise the risk is that people apply a much more cautious frame to other things they're doing. And my final reflection would be that in some ways, I think that's what COVID and the pandemic have done. They've given people permission in a very active way to move faster, to take more risk, and to do more than they would normally do, because people can see that the alternative is not acceptable. And so we had a really rich discussion, I think, that actually went beyond communications and staff engagement into that really interesting area of how you can build a much more bottom-up innovative culture, and how you can tackle some of the barriers that might get in the way of creating that.
Well, we can pick up on that last point now in the discussion that we have, but that's such a good way of putting it, where you say there are so many things that the public sector does where we don't want failure, where we can't afford to have failure, but actually if we can't then chunk up different bits of a project or program and allow kind of different ways of doing things, different risk approaches in other areas, then we're kind of missing a trick there. So thank you for those responses to the very first question. I think what I'm going to do, because we've only got about 15, 20 minutes left here, so I'm going to pose a couple of questions together and ask for your thoughts on these. And you've already touched on some of these. You've already given some examples of maybe barriers that are there, and maybe some good things that are coming out, potentially, possibly looking from COVID and what that's kind of exposed in terms of how you can innovate if you absolutely need to. But I'm going to ask you then, in terms of all of the barriers, the constraints, the obstacles that are still in the way for innovation, whether that's in terms of leadership or just innovation in generally, as you were talking about there, Susan, what do you think are the most stubborn obstacles that still exist? And then, because we have limited time, I'm also going to ask you to think about, are there any brilliant examples that you can think about of where those obstacles are now being overcome? Of some really good examples of things that are happening, and that could be COVID related or anything else that you know about that's going on in your country or your department or your organisation. Let's mix up the order a little bit. Oliver, I'm going to come to you to kick off this one.
Thank you. I'm busy trying to think of the brilliant example whilst I speak, but let me answer the first bit of your question first. Look, it's interesting. Our conversation, it talked about things that others have already mentioned a bit. In places, a culture of being risk averse. In places, having senior leadership, whether that's ministers or senior officials, whatever the construct is in different countries, being sort of, on the one hand, super risk averse, but on the other hand, liking to take risks, but then deflecting the blame, those kind of things. People talked about innovation often being used as a bit of a shorthand for cost control and cost cutting, and having to lead to cost cutting immediately, and often innovation not being about cost cutting, but being about better services all round rather than necessarily cheaper services, but also perhaps having a 3 or 4 year payoff. So these are fairly traditional things, but let me talk about a couple of things maybe less traditional. I think firstly, there was a general sense that maybe the question isn't quite right, that actually there aren't necessarily loads of barriers to innovation. It's more of a cultural thing, and we can argue culture is a barrier too, but in terms of really hard-edged barriers, there aren't perhaps as many as people think. And then the second thing that our group definitely talked about a lot, and I mentioned this in my first answer, really, was about inclusivity and sort of seeing everyone as an innovator. So avoiding a pitfall where we said, we've got 4% of my organisation is the innovators, and everyone else is sort of business as usual or doing something else. But trying to say, well, actually 100% of my organisation is in the innovation space, and therefore sort of challenging everyone to make it their job to be innovating the whole time and making it much more sort of inclusive and democratic in that space. And I suppose that really goes to the culture point that I mentioned, more than attacking kind of hard barriers to innovation. So that was my sort of comments on the kind of barriers, hard and soft, I suppose. You put us on the spot with asking us for a case study. Why don't I use the case study that we presented yesterday? I mentioned it briefly, and what was interesting about it, so it started off, the exam question was really, how can you promote economic development in a particular state in India? And there were a couple of features about the project that were fascinating and were innovative. Perhaps they shouldn't have been innovative, but they were. The first one was the team completely recut the question and made sure they understood what the real problem was. And the real problem was, in fact, employment and, in a sense, per capita income that actually went to the people involved rather than went outside the state. And so what the surface was a sort of exam question that could have been answered by some sort of high-tech manufacturing capability was the wrong question. And it was a question that needed to employ large numbers of people. And in particular, they wanted economic growth that employed half the workforce, either female half of the workforce. So I think being really careful about defining the actual question and the actual outcomes that you want was the really innovative thing. And the second thing was high levels of consultation with those individuals that you're trying to target, in this case, females not in the workforce in this particular state, and coming up with radically different answers and not the answers you thought you were going to come up with. In this case, things like provision of dormitories and pension type arrangements, rather than perhaps the classic R&D tax credits and other things that you hear about in glossy magazines. So the two innovations in that case, just to recap, were one, very careful sort of problem definition, and secondly, being very open through consultation to completely different solutions than those that you sort of started off with in the back of your mind.
Thank you. I mean, they sound really simple things, but they are such important things, and things that, thinking back on policies that I've worked on, don't always happen that way. Just to say, we are going to extend our time by a little bit, so we're going to add on a bit of time at the end. So you do have a bit more time to think about some good practice examples as well. So if there are any more that you want to throw in, Oliver, at the end, I'm quite happy to come back to you. But I think we're going to run to about 4:50. So I want to come to, and also a reminder to people who are watching, you do still have time to submit some questions if you want to, that means. Magnus, I'm going to come to you then to talk about, what do you think are those really stubborn kind of obstacles to innovation, to leaders in innovation, and also where do you think good things are happening, some examples of things that are going well?
Yes, we had an interesting discussion. I can start with a good example. It was actually a medtech company that came to a hospital. This is a true story, but it's sort of anecdotal. And they came up with this solution that would really free up resources in that hospital. The doctor that listened to the presentation said, okay, I hear what you say, but which nurse do you think I should fire in able to free up their resources to implement your solution? So it's an example of sort of 30 years of public management focus on productivity, which has led to that many organizations are so anaerobic today. So there's no financial space or resource space to innovate. And this is kind of a hard obstacle for innovation, because we need to change our thinking on how we finance the public sector, and how can we find room for public sector venture capitals, find space for that. So that was a really interesting discussion. Didn't come up with an answer though. Second one was also sort of the reverse side of that coin, is the expectation from media and the citizens that, oh, you should not spend any tax money for anything than you have to. So taking risk or being innovative is wasting tax money. So the whole surrounding society, including media, is expecting to be as productive as possible and not to be innovative. So that culture really needs to change. The media needs to see that, oh, we have to take risk to risk the tax money in order to do better. And a third part of that, it was sort of connected, that discussion is the culture inside the public sector, because we're sort of living in a world where we've done, okay, we've built a modern welfare state, here we are now, we're just gonna take care of it, you know, while the rest of the world around us is just zooming by, and we've sort of lost touch with the fact that innovation is part of the civil servant DNA. We invented the state, and we have to continue reinvent it each day. So how can we build a culture where we see change as everyday activity? So it was a fun discussion, but you know, I can't come up with any good answers. I do have, though, a good example, and it's actually a Swedish initiative that's been running for about 10 years now, more maybe even 15. It's called a Zero Vision. It's a traffic sort of mission type of project that says we should have no casualties in traffic. And that is a collaboration between public sector and the private sector in order to innovate from that political vision. I think it's a good example where politics can sort of do moonshots to set up, this is where we want to go, now go innovate. And that provides an incentive for both private and public sector to come together in order to solve that challenge. So I think that's a very interesting example how you can use missions to drive and build incentives for innovation. Thanks.
Thank you. The issue of having a clear vision came up surprisingly for me in several of the panel sessions that we had this morning. So I think that's really important, that without a clear vision, it's hard for people to buy in to that kind of need for innovation as well. And some really tricky issues there, which I'm going to be mean and ask Susan about in a minute. So this idea of kind of, it's, you know, it's easy enough to say that we want people to not be afraid of failure, but when you have a media and a public who really want to make sure that taxpayer money is being spent wisely, then that's much easier said than done to kind of have that culture shift. So Susan, if you have any thoughts on those tricky issues that Magnus raised, it would be great to hear. But also I just want your thoughts from your workshop and your experience of what do you think those really stubborn barriers are? And also your chance to give some great examples of innovation that's happening in the UK.
Thanks very much indeed. So I think that reflection on you know, are there really barriers, or is a lot of it about culture, is a good reflection. And I think sometimes we're kind of acutely conscious of the things that make things hard to do, rather than kind of you know, again, it's another form of permission giving. We need to give ourselves permission and recognise our own agency and capability in this, because I think sometimes barriers are used as an excuse for not getting on with things. Having said that, I really recognise Magnus's point about some public sector organisations that have got so slender that the kind of space for any kind of growth or innovation has been kind of stripped away as waste, and it's really difficult to kind of carve out the space to do the thinking. And I mean, I certainly encountered, particularly in the early years of HMCTS reform, that mindset that said kind of, why are you wasting all this money on a change programme? Why don't you fix the following things about the way the organisation isn't working at the moment? And we had to work really hard to explain, well, I can't sustainably fix those things unless we do this change programme, because that's going to give me the capability to mean that, you know, we can, you know, I know it sounds simple to you to say people in court should pick up the phone, but actually at the moment, every court in the country is running off an office type phone system. That means we can't even see how many people are queuing. We don't even know how many calls we've missed. And so there's a piece of investment that's needed to get us to the place where we even know what the problem is, let alone can solve it. And it sounds daft, but sometimes there are some things that are just kind of basics that you have to be able to invest in moving beyond. Come on to the hard questions in a minute. Just in terms of picking a couple of examples. I've got a nice one from the court system, which is a bit of sort of, sometimes if you've got the right things in place, you can find your moment to make change, which is something I kind of passionately believe in. So sometimes it's all about having a massive plan. Sometimes it's about having the ingredients and being able to find the kind of political, emotional, cultural moment that allows the change to happen. So we've been doing a lot of work as part of court reform about how we could use video technology more effectively in court. We used it already a fair amount in the criminal system, but much less in the civil, family and tribunal system. And we've just begun a small piece of work with the Special Educational Needs and Disability Tribunal to give them some video technology. And we had judges who were quite cautious about it, who wanted to take it very, very, very slowly and carefully. But we had put some technology in and given the ability. And when the pandemic hit, that meant that we were in a place where they could suddenly see a reason to use it and could switch it on really, really quickly. And it addressed a whole series of challenges we have in those tribunals. So typically for a family with a severely disabled child coming to a tribunal, we don't have SEN and disability tribunals kind of absolutely everywhere across the country, so you're typically having to travel a bit. It's quite complicated if you're a family in that situation. We also quite often run them out of other court buildings, so we have to move the tribunal panel, which is a tribunal judge. Also we'll have a special educational needs expert as well. We've got to get them all together in the place. We've got to make sure we've got the room. And lots of those people are doing other jobs as well, so you also have to manage yourself around their time. Now, flipping the tribunals to work on video solved a whole series of problems for parents, for the judges, for us in finding the resource. And we sort of half knew that was going to happen, but we hadn't managed to find the cultural key to unlock enough use to prove that it was going to work. So we were still dabbling around in the one here and there, which didn't quite give us enough scale. And COVID suddenly gave us every special educational needs and disability tribunal in the first lockdown period went virtual. And we actually managed not just to keep up with the same number that we normally do, but to slightly exceed the number we normally do. And we then found we were being heavily lobbied by parents never to turn these tribunals physical again. And it was a really interesting example of, sometimes you have your ducks lined up and what you need is the moment to make the change so that you can persuade people of the case and the cause. And just on the question about, how do you overcome the risk aversion? I mean, I've talked quite a lot in other forums about, I think there's a really interesting point around this. And Magnus, I love your thing about the civil service have always been innovators. And then we get into this sort of curation mode and suddenly imagine that our job is to sort of, broadly speaking, keep things the same. There is something really odd. I mean, the risk you feel that you're running, I think, as a civil servant, from doing a big new thing that people might point at and say hasn't worked, feels much more acute and exposing than the risk you run for kind of keeping on doing roughly what you've been doing forever. And there are far fewer mechanisms of accountability, so things like the Public Accounts Committee in the UK, that point themselves at inaction as opposed to at failed action. And I don't know whether I don't think I'm proposing that we make the penalties for inaction higher, but I do think there's something we could think about how in our systems of accountability and actually perhaps as leaders ourselves, we make sure that we're paying as much attention to the areas where people are in kind of, have got themselves into policy maintenance mode and are calling out and paying attention to missed opportunities and to opportunity cost, as we do when people try a new thing and it doesn't always work. We're much more tolerant of people providing a second-rate service if it's the second-rate service we've always had.
Really interesting thoughts there. Seong, I want to come to you to finish off this round of comments. So what you've heard there, is that, do you recognise some of those barriers, some of those obstacles? Are they the same things you're facing in Korea? And you started with a great example already, but is there another example you could give us of kind of good innovation, good innovative leadership? I'm coming over to you now.
Yes, the Korean government has been facing these barriers over the years as well, in addition to the department silos that I mentioned in the beginning of today's session. And I would like to just briefly talk about what we are doing in terms of in order to overcome those barriers. So next week, we will have the Government Innovation Expo. The Ministry of the Interior and Safety is in charge of driving the government innovation across the nation. So we always look for innovative cases from the regional governments or different ministries, and each year we showcase them, created a platform where government agencies can come together and also get our citizens involved so that they know how government is trying to innovate. This platform, this expo, has been great in providing permission to other government agencies to innovate freely, and by championing failures at those expos, that we are trying to learn from our failures and give them second chance to experiment, do experiments again, without being afraid to fail, spending citizens' tax. And also through this expos, we are promoting collaboration among agencies. So for example, one of the metropolitan city called Daejeon in Korea, they started AI-based smart mirror service for people using sign language, so they can access government digital service in a natural language. It's their innovative case, but many of different regional governments and even central governments are looking into taking those innovation into their own agencies, which should help them save time and reduce budget. Yeah, those are some of the good examples that I would like to share with you today to overcome those barriers mentioned earlier.
So I love the idea of the expo and bringing people together. So both in terms of giving them permission to do things, but also just physically fostering collaboration as well, which is a really nice final example to end on. So before we wrap up this session, very quickly, I'm going to come to each of our panel members in turn. The issue of COVID and how it's kind of forced innovation and forced better collaboration and new ways of working has repeatedly come up throughout this event over the last 2 days. I just want to ask you very simply, have you got hope that in future we are going to have more innovative leaders, either building on what we've learned through the pandemic or other things that are already going on? And Susan, I'm going to come to you first.
Thanks very much indeed. Yes, I'm very leaders are dealers in hope. And I think that's a really nice idea, that we're here to give hope to others and to make sure that we unleash their talent. Robert Jarvik rather less poetically said, leaders are visionaries with a poorly developed sense of fear and no concept of the odds against them. But I love that. Descriptions of leadership that help us think about what it means to innovate. And I think we will see lots more innovation in some sense. And by the way, I'm not sure it's more. I think Magnus really powerfully reminded us we've always been innovators, and we just have to keep hold of that heritage and keep going.
Love that. Love that. Keep hold of that heritage. I really like that. Oliver, over to you. Do you think we have hope for more innovative leaders in future?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, I think COVID, as you said, has proven that the public service can definitely innovate at speed, and it's proven to sort of public service stakeholders in terms of both ministers and the general public. I think the one thing I would say is that it will be easy to go back to normal post-COVID, and in so many ways we are all looking forward to that normality. But it'd be really important to sort of keep hold of the innovative practices that we've all demonstrated over the last 9 months ago, not let those drift back. So we have to do this now as with luck, COVID recedes, and really sort of capture that spirit of innovation and make it something that's really permanent.
Brilliant, thank you, Oliver. Seong, over to you. Do you think there's hope for even more innovative leaders in future?
I think as governments can take this crisis and turn it into an opportunity, and then create more innovation-friendly environment for our civil servants and then leaders to drive innovation within government. And I have seen changes in mindsets of my colleagues and other government leaders. And also we are considering innovation approach when we are talking about government digital service, which was not on anyone's mind before in Korea, before the pandemic. So these changes are positive signs that in the future we will have more innovative leaders within government. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Magnus, I'm going to come to you for the final word. I hope you say yes as well to leave us on a positive note.
Yes, I'm optimistic because necessity is the mother of all invention. And it's so clear that we're facing all these challenges and we need to take them head on somehow. But, you know, it's what we need to do as public servants. We need to reinvent ourselves. But beyond that, I think we have to strike up a conversation on what we mean by building a post-bureaucratic state. What will it look like? What's our vision? What is the next level of government? And we need to frame images and metaphors for that, so we have some kind of common direction to work in. And I think beyond that, we need to also invite journalists, media, to participate in innovative projects so they understand how darn difficult it is. and so they get a sense of the conditions within which we work. And I think that could generate some kind of sense of hope, I think, also within the culture that we need to do this together, not just being passive bystanders or critical bystanders. They're part of the picture too. All right.
Thank you so much. That's a real positive, but also a bit of a challenge there to civil servants, that we have to reinvent ourselves and remember that heritage, that innovative heritage that we have. Thank you so much to all of our panel members. Thank you to all of you for sticking through those technical issues that we had, and to everybody that was watching. I think we had a fantastic discussion there for the final panel of the day. So thank you so much. I'm going to say goodbye to our panel members now before I give some closing remarks for the event. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, so it just comes to me now to bring Innovation 2020 to a close. And I want to start by saying, on a personal note, really, what an absolute pleasure it has been to be part of this event over the last couple of days. Especially today, I've been part of fantastic discussions in 5 panel sessions. So we looked at skills and tools, at data sharing, at new technology, governance and finance, and finally their innovative leadership. And just a couple of things, reflections from me on the common themes that emerged throughout those discussions is how much we have learned from this pandemic. I mean, it's an awful situation to be in, but it really has forced government, civil services to work in much more innovative ways. And so many people were saying today how they hope that those lessons wouldn't be learned, that we would actually capture some of that as a positive legacy going forward. And then I think there were 3 real things that struck me, and that was they were all framed by actually the biggest barriers that people mentioned weren't actually structural barriers. They weren't actually things around departmental silos or funding, as tough as those are. They were more about those cultural barriers and the need for people to change their mindset and to approach innovation in a different way. And in particular, the importance of leadership, which we've just heard about in that final session. So not just from the very top down, but also kind of more at the middle management level, having leaders that permit people to try things and permit people to fail. That was really important. The need to set a vision, a clear vision for what governments and civil services are trying to do, so that the public and partners and all agencies and departments buy into that. And that can also help alleviate some of the distrust maybe that the public have in some of the things that we really need to do more of, like data sharing So that was really important. And then finally, the crucial thing, how much collaboration is key to all of this. And that's what's so great about events like this, that it's all about coming together, sharing best practice, working across different agencies, different departments, different countries and different professions. And if we can crack that, then we really could get better at innovation. I would like to thank all of the speakers that we've had over the last 2 days, all of the brilliant workshop chairs who brought all of those threads together, and all of you who have participated and engaged over the past 2 days. And we are extremely grateful to our partner, the UK Civil Service and the Cabinet Office, and to our brilliant knowledge partners as well, to EY, to Google Cloud, to Workday and Huawei. As headline knowledge partner, we are deeply indebted for the continued input and guidance and support from EY and their expert team. And I would also like to add a personal thanks to me, to Sue, Kevin, Maxine and Max from Global Government Forum, who were there behind the scenes making all of this happen. Now, I don't need to tell you that 2020 has been an extremely challenging year. Not in our lifetime have governments across the world faced the same threat, all these different threats at exactly the same time. And it's this shared awful challenge that makes our world a smaller place and cements the need for governments around the globe to work together and share experiences, learning and ideas. And as we've just heard in all of those sessions, and especially in that final session, it's through collaboration and by stimulating innovation, both nationally and internationally, that we can face these challenges together and develop faster, better outcomes for our citizens. Thank you to all of you who are watching here today for what you do. As civil servants, you make the world a better place. I look forward to Innovation 2021, where I hope that we can safely meet face to face and to further these discussions and to build stronger links around the world. Thank you, everybody, and good evening.